Harold Bloom is here. He is Sterling Professor of Humanities at Yale. He has written more than 20 books, including the Western Canon, the Book of J, and The Anxiety of Influence. His most recent is Jesus and Yahweh, the Names Divine. I am pleased to have Harold Bloom back at this table. Welcome back.
Thank you, Charlie.
Why are you writing a book about religion? I mean, that's not seeming to me. Are you agnostic or non-believer?
I am not a non-believer, no. I am not an agnostic. I am a Gnostic, G-N-O-S-T-I-C.
What's that mean?
Well, that means that there is a true God buried deep within the rock of the self, and the other aspect of God is lost, wandering in the outer spaces somewhere. But the God of this world, think of the title of the book, The Name is Divine. I'm quoting William Blake.
Who said?
Who said, "Truly, my Satan, thou art but a dunce, and dost not know the garment from the man. Every harlot was a virgin once, nor canst thou ever change Cain to that. Though thou art worshipped by the name is divine of Jesus and Jehovah, thou art still the son of morn, and weary nights decline, the lost traveler's dream under the hill." Yes.
Which means?
Which means that Jehovah, who's after all just a spelling error for Yahweh, and Jesus are names that we give something which is beyond all names and which in fact has abdicated and left our solar system.
William Blake is my friend Chris Christopherson's favorite poet.
He has been mine since I was a little child, and that's rather a long time ago now, Charlie.
You're, what, 75 now?
75, dear, yes. When I first met you, I was a mere 65, and you don't look a day older. But then, though I don't say you've sold out to the devil, I keep wondering about you, Charlie.
What do you wonder about me?
Because you don't look a day older.
If only you knew, this weary body. Okay, so here's a central thesis. Tell me what the central thesis of this is.
The central thesis of this book is very simple and is already giving a great deal of offense. There are three very separate figures.
Especially the Christians.
Yes, but also some Jews. There is a more or less historical personage, Jesus of Nazareth. I say more or less historical because we have no verifiable facts about him.
But there was at some point in the history of the world a person who walked in Bethlehem
for the
named
historical
Jesus of Nazareth.
Jesus have always failed. But evidently there was such a person, but we have nothing verifiable about him. There is a theological or Hellenistic mystery dying and reviving God named Jesus Christ. And there is the non-theological God, the human, all too human, original God of the Tanakh or Hebrew Old Testament, Yahweh. And he is not theological at all. And the fundamental argument of the book is that it is not possible to make a coherent statement which links these three highly diverse figures. And if indeed that argument is right, then the religious history of the last 2,000 years is a disaster.
Okay, let's just stay with two of those, not forget Yahweh for a second.
Yes.
And he's supposed to be the son of Yahweh. Jesus is the son of Yahweh.
Yes, yes.
What's wrong with the historical... Why can't we believe that the historical Jesus and the Jesus of Christ is not the same person?
We have 7 different versions of Jesus in the canonical Greek New Testament. They cannot be reconciled.
Because they wrote years later, so they made a lot of mistakes.
They are written at different times. They're all written after the death of Jesus, whoever he was and whenever that was. Not one of them, I believe, is written by someone who could ever have heard him, seen him, encountered him in any way. They are all of them conversionary documents. I cannot put any credence in them whatsoever, and I've been reading them in the Greek original almost my whole lifetime now. He was a faithful servant of what he called Yahweh alone, whom he called Abba in Aramaic. Jesus, Yahweh being his God.
And his father?
Well, he never says that, except in the sense, well, he says Abba, but many Jews would have said Abba or Father to Yahweh. Nowhere does he say that he is God.
He nowhere says that I'm the Son of God?
No.
Jesus Christ never said that?
No. That is said for him by St. Paul. That is said for him by later theologians. That is, in a sense, implied for him in the Gospel of John, which is, however, written 100 years afterwards or so. No, he himself makes no such claim. He is a faithful Jew, and however he lived and died, he dies faithful to the law of Moses and to the worship of Yahweh. Jesus Christ is an extremely complex theological God who has almost nothing in common with the more or less historical Jesus. As for Yahweh, he is a story completely unto himself and cannot be accommodated to these two figures
But he
at
is
all.
the story of the New Old Testament, right?
Well, what the Christians call the Old Testament. I'm never very happy with calling it the Old Testament because that implies that I always like to call them the original Testament and the belated Testament, Charlie. Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, does not acknowledge that it has been superseded, though I am well aware and even remarked in the book at one point that historically the Jews long ago lost. There are at this time, Charlie, in the world 1.5 billion Muslims, 1.5 billion Christians, and perhaps 14 million self-identifying Jews. That's a 1,000 to 1 ratio. So clearly, either Yahweh has not been on the job or something else has gone wrong.
Well, then that's an interesting question. To what do you attribute the power of Jesus?
There are two different ways of getting at this, Charlie, and I've spent a lot of my life thinking about this. On the one hand, we must face history and secular power, what one author rightly called the sword of Constantine. The Roman Emperor Constantine, enforcing it by the sword, became a Christian, and his authority, that is to say his military power, enforced it upon everyone. On the other hand, I cannot deny that the notion that salvation should come from a single individual who has somehow died for one's sins has always made an enormous appeal in the world. Here in the United States, it's a very separate question, Charlie, because as you know, at least as well as I do, we have the American Jesus, just as we have the American Holy Spirit of the Pentecostalists, and they have almost nothing to do with the European
Well, how can you say
Jesus.
there's American Jesus? I mean, the Americans who are Roman Catholics.
There are indeed.
They're Americans, and is their
traditional
Jesus any
American-
different than a Catholic in Italy or a Catholic in
I
Belgium?
believe to a remark. I wrote a book called The American Religion many years ago, which we need not get into now. But I would say that there is indeed a distinct American religion, and that we would not have the tyranny of George W. Bush without it. But that is so complex a matter that I don't know that we want to get into that immediately. I'm a very frightened man. At 75, I find that increasingly I'm living in a theocracy.
That would be the United States of America.
Yes, and that is not what the Constitution called for.
A theocracy?
A theocracy, yes.
Now, when you say theocracy...
The state of Texas, Charlie, just announced that it was a Christian state in a Christian country. Now, we have Buddhists, Muslims,
how does the
Jews.
state of Texas announce that? Through legislation? Through what?
The governor announced that he wished the legislature to consider this matter. Obviously, they're not going to get very far.
That's not an announcement by the state of Texas. If the governor says, I wish it this way, I mean, there are a lot of people who take their religion and make all kinds of things in which they wish, that
Charlie,
everybody would accept their belief, which theirs is the only God.
I don't wish to be a complete alarmist, dear, but consider how far we've come already in the last 5 years. Who knows what awaits us in the years to come? Thus, I have a nightmare in which it's January 2009, and Jeb Bush is standing there on the platform, and he is being inaugurated.
You think that's going to happen?
Yes, I do.
You do?
Oh, yes. Let us not underestimate Mr. Karl Rove. Even if he has to do it from a jail cell, he'll do it.
Yeah. Now, a lot of people share this.
This nightmare vision, shall we call it?
Well, a lot of people do share real concerns about the violation of the separation of church and state. That line has become blurred.
Blurred is putting it very gently, Charles.
But you do seem to, in this book, to have some real criticisms of Christianity as practiced in America. Beyond the fact that you think America is becoming a theocracy, and I assume that when you talk about a theocracy, you're talking about a, quote, Christian nation. Are you not?
Yes, but of course, American Christianity, I repeat, has very little in common with European or traditional Christianity. It is very indigenous to this country. It has been very different, in fact, I think, since the great Cane Ridge revivals on the Kentucky-Tennessee border in the year 1801. And in the last 2 centuries, it has exfoliated in a most remarkable way.
Let me get to some things you say. You say Hamlet, Kierkegaard, and Kafka are all Ironist in the wake of Jesus.
They certainly are all deeply influenced by the Jesus of the Gospel of Mark, who is a fascinating figure, I must say.
Mark?
No, Jesus.
Jesus, yes.
Whoever Mark was, he is a fascinating writer, yes.
Yeah. You find Jesus fascinating.
There's no question of that.
What fascinates him about you? What is it you find fascinating?
The Jesus of the Gospel of Mark is a man who is always in a hurry. He's moving through crowds. He cannot pause. He is driven. He does not know who he is. He's perpetually asking his disciples, but who do people say I am? Unlike all the other versions of Jesus, he goes through a night of memorable agony, the last night of his life, in anticipation of the horror he must endure. The next day, he is an extraordinarily rendered and immensely moving figure, I would have to admit.
On his last day.
On the night before the last day. On the last day, he is swept away by what happens to him.
Help me understand more what you find fascinating beyond in the Gospel of St. Mark.
He is an enigma of enigmas.
He walks through this life and he's always asking,
who am I? He speaks only in dark sayings. He speaks in riddles and in parables. He is uncertain as to his own identity. He's uncertain as to exactly what his relationship to God is. He has very little in common with the Jesus of the other Gospels, particularly of the final Gospel, the Gospel of John.
How is he different?
He's isolated.
No, how's he? What do they say about him, Luke and John, that are different than what Mark says?
John clearly sees him as a supernatural figure, sees him as a violently combative figure, sees him as someone who is immensely sure of his own identity. In terms of personality, that is as far away as you can be from the Jesus of the Gospel of Mark. And is, I must say, considerably less interesting to a mere literary critic like myself.
Yeah. You approach this book as because almost to do it as a kind of literary story.
What do we have in relation to Jesus Christ, Yahweh, or for that matter, Allah? We have literary texts. All distinctions, Charlie, between secular and sacred texts are ultimately just political. These are literary characters. They are perhaps more than literary characters. They doubtless, for most human beings, transcend being literary characters.
You mean by this Jesus, Muhammad, all religious figures?
I mean that we encounter them the way we encounter Hamlet or King Lear.
What is written about them?
Yes, dear. They are texts. We have no access to them beyond that. There is, of course, historical theology, but that always comes later. But we encounter them in written texts.
As historical figures?
Not necessarily as historical figures. We do not have more than a handful of verifiable facts, if we even have a handful about Jesus. Jesus Christ being a theological formulation, one doesn't ask for facts. Do not forget that St. Paul quite beautifully defines faith as the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Now, that's a very curious kind of substance, and of course, that isn't evidence.
Yeah. Here's what I would say. Whatever you believe about Jesus, the message must be, you must find something that is extraordinary in the message that has been attributed to Jesus, because it has won and it has received in time an extraordinary number of believers.
But so has Islam, Charlie.
Absolutely.
And there are 1.5 billion of them.
Exactly. And so that must say something powerful about Islam as well.
That there is certainly...
There's something there.
There is indeed something there, Charlie. It has remarkable
that resonates with an extraordinary...
It has conversionary power.
Yeah,
because,
exactly.
frankly, it offers a great deal in return for rather little, if you pardon my saying so.
Meaning that what comes from believing is nothing?
You are asked to believe that something is so, and on that basis you believe and have faith in
All
Christianity.
religions are based on faith.
Not Judaism, oddly enough. It's based on trust. I am myself a
trusting in what?
Heretical on the covenant that supposedly has been, as we say, cut with you by Yahweh. I do not trust in it because it seems to me he has never kept its terms. But we are asked for emunah. We are asked to trust in the covenant. Now, that is not believing that something is so. I happen not to trust in the covenant because it does not seem to me that Yahweh, who is the most fascinating literary figure I've ever encountered, has ever done anything which would cause anyone to trust him at all.
Yahweh is more a fascinating literary figure than Jesus?
Ultimately, yes.
Ultimately.
In the same way that King Lear...
ultimately is a hedge
in the
word.
same way that,
Ultimately is a hedge word.
let's forget the hedge word. King Lear is finally... Let's get rid of finally. King Lear is more fascinating to me even than Hamlet. Yahweh is more fascinating to me even than Jesus.
Why?
Because the enormous range of significant emotion seems to push at the outward limits of human imagination.
Yeah, but the conceit of Christianity is they're getting both. And I mean by conceit a positive word. Yes? Yes?
Yes and no, Charlie. I don't want to get into a theological argument.
But that is the
with you.
idea is that, you help me.
Yahweh is greatly diminished into something called God the Father.
But it is in the...
It is not exactly the original Yahweh because one cannot conceive,
in the mind of Christians.
one cannot conceive of Yahweh committing
not...
suicide. In effect, Christianity tells us that God the Father, by making himself in some complex way one with his Son, sacrifices himself, in effect commits suicide. That's inconceivable for Yahweh and is unacceptable also to Muslims.
That God gave his only begotten Son.
Yes, but no such doctrine... I mean, that violates strict monotheism according to both Islam and Judaism.
You have said that Christianity is practiced today is essentially polytheistic.
I think so, yes.
Meaning?
Meaning that we have the Son of God, we have God the Father, and we have that fascinating figure, the Holy Spirit, for whom there's actually very little New Testament evidence, but who now in the United States, I think, is the true spirit of what is abroad, because Pentecostalism is the most rapidly spreading faith in the United States. In fact, it has become the faith of the disinherited.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that the Christian right has so severely compromised any kind of traditional Christianity that when Hispanics come here, and many blacks, and many poor whites, and so on, they naturally turn to Pentecostalism, to the Assemblies of God and allied groups, because Jesus Christ CEO is not to their taste. And the Jesus Christ whom George W. Bush says is his favorite philosopher might indeed be called Jesus Christ CEO. He is not someone who believes that it is the poor who will easily find entrance into the kingdom of heaven. I know this is offensive, what I'm saying, but the offense is surely not mine. The offense is George W. Bush's.
When somebody says something about religion that they say and it comes from their heart, I give them a pass on that.
I'm not saying anything from my heart.
No, I'm saying from their heart.
From their heart.
George Bush says that his most influential philosopher is Jesus Christ, and I say, that's fine. I
guess it leaves me a little speechless, Charles.
I know it does. What George Bush said?
Yes, dear.
Yeah. Well,
I think there's a kind of effrontery in it.
To say that?
Yes, dear.
Can I turn to Shakespeare only because I like to have every time you come to this table at least something that we can get our hands around with respect to Shakespeare? You believe Shakespeare has contributed more to this world than Jesus Christ has?
I think that...
Or any religious figure.
All of us, whoever we are, and I tell this to my students every week, I think that it's positively astonishing to us that what we like to think are our own deepest emotions were in fact initially Shakespeare's thoughts. And there is no other writer of whom you could make so extraordinary a statement.
Let me repeat what you just said.
You and I experience fierce emotions, Charlie. Yes. Those emotions which we would like to feel are indigenous to us, which emerge from our own hearts, are in fact Shakespeare's thoughts. We would not feel...
Nobody before Shakespeare?
I cannot think of any representation in Western literature of a young woman overwhelmingly and generous in love before he writes Juliet in Romeo and Juliet.
No one expressed that emotion of a woman being overwhelmingly in love before William Shakespeare wrote that, Romeo and Juliet.
No one expresses so profound a sense of being unselfishly in love with another human being.
No one, in your judgment,
In some deep sense, our relationship, our sense of what the ratio is between language, thought, and feeling owes more to Shakespeare than to anyone else who's ever written, be it a philosopher.
Language, thought, and what else?
Feeling.
Feeling. And
he has educated us.
Okay. No one has even raised a single solitary doubt when they have questioned the authorship of William Shakespeare.
It fascinates me that this is one of our major modern madnesses, this desperate need to prove that someone, anyone except Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. Every month, Charlie, I am sent by a society in London, and I don't solicit this, their literature. They are wholly devoted to proving that all of the writings of Lewis Carroll were in fact written by Queen Victoria herself. Yes. That's, I think, I also like to point out that it was only last year that the founder of the American Flat Earth Society passed into the great beyond.
What do you think of Harold Pinter getting the Nobel Prize for Literature?
When you consider that their last several choices were unbelievable, I hadn't even heard of the two before him, I would say that it's a perfectly gorgeous choice. The Caretaker, the Homecoming, the Birthday Party are remarkable plays. They are very indebted to Samuel Beckett. He can never really get Samuel Beckett out of his head, but he does exploit stage silence perhaps more powerfully than anyone except Samuel Beckett does.
He can't get Beckett out of his head when he writes?
No, I think the influence is always there, but still, it's Beckett was a very great writer.
You said Cervantes and Don Quixote is Shakespeare's only rival for the highest aesthetic
In terms
glory.
of Western literature, since at least Dante, and that is a long way back there, then only Cervantes is a true rival to Shakespeare. Shakespeare gives you 100 major characters and 1,000 minor characters. Each of them has a personality and a voice of her or his own. Cervantes gives you only two, the knight and the squire, Sancho, but they are on such a huge and magnificent scale that he almost matches Shakespeare.
Who is the greatest American person of letters?
Walt Whitman, beyond any question, which in a strange way can take one back to Jesus and Yahweh again, because though Whitman was not a Christian and made clear that he was not a Christian, he has, I think, profound affinities to the Jesus of the Gospel of Mark. There's something forlorn and solitary about the Jesus of the Gospel of Mark. Like Walt Whitman, he's always up ahead of you, waiting for you to catch up. There is something isolate and splendid. But Whitman, in my judgment, and it's taken me a long time to arrive at this view, Charlie, in the 4 centuries in which imaginative literature of the Western sort has existed in our hemisphere, whether in Spanish, French, Portuguese, or English, Whitman is much the finest writer, the most original, the most comprehensive, the one who has most changed the world.
This book is called Jesus and Yahweh, The Names Divine. Harold Bloom, it's always great to have you here.
Thank you, Charlie.
It's good to see you.
Thank you, dear.
Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.